you on the flip side.
Oh God! What the Okay? Not okay! I was just listening to a nice conversation!
This is an example of horror done right. And this is when, well, just see for yourself.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Yeah, it's a total 180 from what the original Five Nights at Freddy's accomplished. So what are these underlying factors that makes Garten of Banban fail, and what makes Five Nights at Freddy's so scary? To backtrack a bit, horror games are hard to get right. It's a genre where the stakes are high. If you mess up with the tension while making the game, the whole thing falls apart. But when everything clicks, when the fear feels real, it's one of the most memorable gaming experiences that you could ever have. So, what actually makes a good horror game? Atmosphere is the backbone of any good horror game. It's the reason you feel unsettled before anything scary even happens. And no, I'm not just talking about dark hallways and creepy soundtracks, because even though they do help the spook factor, it isn't always what actually scares you. Atmosphere is about how every part of the game world works together to make you feel like you don't belong there. And of the next three subtopics that contribute to the atmosphere of a horror game, the last one is the most often neglected. Let's start with the obvious, lighting. Horror games love to manipulate light and shadow to mess with your head. Ever notice how bright areas in horror games feel oppressive? That's because the lighting isn't just about visibility, it's about creating a mood. In the game you're seeing right now, Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, the lights tell a story. With only natural light being available in the homes, the place looks abandoned. I don't intend for you to know every story beat about The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, but you can understand that from what you're seeing on screen right now, the lighting helps set an unsettling mood that otherwise couldn't have been created through sheer darkness or just bright lights. But lighting isn't the only thing that helps set an atmosphere. There's environmental design. Horror games are really good at making places feel alive in the worst way possible. Sometimes the environment isn't just a backdrop, it's an active participant. Take Dead Space, for example. The Ishimura is more than just a spooky spaceship. It groans, it hisses, and creaks like it's alive, constantly reminding you that nowhere is safe. Especially since you're in the most oppressive space in the universe. Empty space. Or, as they call it, dead space.
She was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch. When his 10-year-old son came to investigate the commotion, the father shot him too.
What you just heard was some of the most unsettling game ambience I've ever heard in a horror game, ever. This subsection on ambience is probably the most important part of an atmosphere that a game could ever provide. Like, ever. The best horror games know how to fill the silence with sounds that aren't quite noticeable until you realize they're making you uneasy. A low hum, the distant drip of water, or even the sound of your own character breathing, it all adds up. In PT, which is the game you're watching right now, the ambience is a masterclass in unease. Even when nothing is happening, the faint whispers and the creaks make it feel like the walls are themselves alive. You start questioning every sound. Is it the game, or is it something you're imagining? And as you heard, the unsettling radio and the small creaks in the whole house that are inevitably repeating all come together to make some of the most unsettling imaginations that your brain could possibly perceive in a game where it's very difficult or next to impossible to die in. However, atmosphere isn't the only thing that contributes to making a good horror game. And that brings us to our next section. Let's talk about survival horror. Perhaps the most prominent survival horror series out there is Resident Evil. After Atmosphere, the next pillar of a great horror game is player vulnerability. This, and what Resident Evil accomplishes, isn't about making the player feel weak for the sake of it, but it's about designing mechanics that makes every choice feel like it matters. This makes a good horror game strip away the power fantasy that most action games provide and replaces it with a survival mindset. The most talked about aspect of survival horror is the limited resources. Horror games thrive on making you feel like you never have enough of anything, whether it's ammo, health, or even something as basic as light. These restrictions force you to think carefully about how you're using what little you've got. Games like Resident Evil do this very well. You might have 6 bullets left, but when one enemy takes 5 to kill, you're not thinking about how do you win this fight, you're thinking, do I even need to fight at all? And that's what most of the OG or more recent Resident Evil games focus on.
But you cannot change rules!
Furthermore, player vulnerability isn't just about what you have, it's about who you are. Horror games rarely let you play as someone capable or powerful. Instead, you're an average person. Like, imagine you are in the game. Someone slow, clumsy, or physically outmatched by everything around them. Okay, that was not meant as an insult, but you know what I mean. This makes every encounter feel like an uphill battle, rather than you are playing as a super soldier. In a lot of modern action games, you can sprint, slide, or dodge roll your way out of danger, aka Call of Duty, but in a horror game, you might trip over a chair, miss the button to open a door, or just not move fast enough. That lack of mobility isn't frustrating, it's intentional. It forces you to confront the danger head on, rather than escaping it easily. In Silent Hill, the game I'm showing you right now, or Silent Hill 2, that's the name of it, you play as James Sunderland, an average person. However, the tank controls and the fact that you're limited in movement helps add to the psychological horror that the game provides. The fixed camera angle helps add to the claustrophobia that the game provides. If we're comparing actually scary enemies from this game to stuff in whatever the frick this is, we can see that enemy design is almost as, if not more important than anything that the atmosphere and player vulnerability can provide. Let's just say that if you have an S tier atmosphere and if you have S tier player vulnerability, and if you hit everything correct in all the previous categories, and you have the crackhead Opila Bird from freaking Garten of Banban, I'll probably put your game in C tier, I'm not gonna lie. A good horror game enemy isn't just scary because of how it looks, though. It's scary about how it behaves and how it interacts with the player's vulnerabilities, as discussed in the previous chapter. First step is unpredictability. Unpredictability is a hallmark of great horror enemies. The best ones don't follow a set pattern, unlike the Nemesis from Resident Evil 3 Remake. Five Nights at Freddy's enemies, like the ones on screen right now, they do follow sort of a set pattern, but the RNG and the fact that you have to keep watch of so many animatronics makes tracking each one kind of nerve-wracking and very difficult, making the game very scary. This unpredictability and RNG forces you to stay alert at all times, turning even mundane tasks like, I don't know, sitting in an office into a nerve-wracking ordeal. Unpredictable behavior isn't just about randomness, though, it's about creating the illusion that the enemy is actively adapting to your actions. When an enemy feels like it's hunting you rather than just following a script, it becomes a lot more terrifying. Good horror game enemies are also lethal, sometimes unfairly so. The best ones can kill you quickly, often in ways that feel overwhelming or unavoidable, unlike some enemies that, if they hit you like a pea shooter, it's not gonna feel scary. This isn't about making the player feel powerless or putting them in situations that seem unfair, it's about making them respect the enemy. When a single mistake can lead to death, you're forced to think carefully about every move you make. And of course, none of this works if the enemies themselves aren't memorable. A great horror game enemy needs to have a distinctive design, something that sticks with the player long enough that after they've stopped playing, they're gonna have nightmares. This doesn't just mean visual design, though that's important, it also includes sound and movement. If you want a good horror game that exemplifies this trait that I'm talking about, you should look at Doors. And even though it's a Roblox game, it does have a lot of the traits that I think make a very good horror game. Of course, one of these traits being the enemy design. The enemies in this game are really scary, and they also correspond pretty well to their environment that they spawn in. Along with the atmosphere, these enemies could be like super scary if you're playing in the dark. When I am talking about breaking the fourth wall, I'm not simply talking about the game being self-aware, even though that is creepy sometimes. I'm referring to the fact that a good horror game needs to blur the line between reality and the horrors that await you. These moments where you see your own life in these games remind you that you're not just playing a game, you are a part of its world. That is the best and scariest thing that a horror game could ever do. Now, there's a lot of ways that horror games could implement these immersive features, but I'm going to talk about something that most horror games do not do, and that is being in virtual reality. There's a reason why I've been putting a lot of VR horror games on the screen. I do have a couple of VR videos in my channel, so if you want to check those out for more in-depth reviews of VR as a whole or just certain VR horror games, I would definitely check those out. The main priority of VR as a whole is to immerse you in its world, and if you're playing a horror game, it can kind of make you feel that you are the victim. In a traditional game, you're always aware of the screen separating you from the action, but in VR, that barrier disappears. When you're standing in a dark room with a monster breathing down your neck, it doesn't feel like you're watching it happen. It feels like you're actually there. And trust me, if you don't believe me, as someone who's played VR, I strongly suggest that you put a headset on yourself and see how it is. VR also forces you to engage with the game world in ways that you wouldn't on a flat screen. Instead of pressing a button to open the door, you have to physically reach out and pull it open. Instead of turning your character's head with a joystick, you literally turn your own head. Why did I make that sound like it was so cool? This makes every action feel personal and immediate, and intimate. If you're hiding from an enemy, crouching behind a desk in real life, it's a completely different level of tension. Just imagine doing what's on screen right now in VR. Now that I've yapped enough about what a good horror game should accomplish, let's talk about some examples. What is the horror game that I think embodies the traits that I find so endearing in a horror game the most? And I would have two answers. Both because each game has its own unique strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, the first one being Amnesia: The Bunker. Honestly, this game has one of the most unique and oppressive atmospheres I've ever seen in a horror game, and I love it. The game has a beautiful yet realistic art style that takes Amnesia in a unique direction, especially for it being survival horror. This also makes it so this game has limited resources, making the fear factor of avoiding monsters compounded with the fact that you're fighting for your life with almost nothing. This game also has a very disturbing yet I think impressive looking monster design. I'm not going to show the monster on screen because I want you to play this game for the first time and I want you to see it for the first time. And lastly, immersion. Now I do dock some points off for it not being a VR title, but that honestly doesn't matter because with how impressive the sound design is for this game, how realistic it feels you going through this bunker, how realistic the graphics are, which also helps a bit for the immersion, just all combines to make honestly an amazing immersive experience. Do I think this game should be in VR? I am 98% sure that it should. The other 2% is from me being completely scared of the fact that doing this in VR would probably cause a lot of trauma for people playing. This game is honestly just that scary. The next contender on this list has to be a game that I hold dear to my heart, and that has to be Dread Halls. You're seeing on screen right now. This game, while the other game took a lot of points home for the atmosphere, this game takes a lot of points home for the immersion. It is honestly some of the scariest and most immersive VR I have ever experienced in my life. The atmosphere as well is super oppressive, and most of the horror from this game comes just from the anticipation of seeing some of the enemies. If you don't know how all the enemies look like and you don't know how to deal with most of them, you are gonna have a freaking heart attack. I'm just saying, it is so scary. I also have a full detailed video on this game. I have to admit, that video describes everything and every reason why I love this game so much, so I would definitely check that out if I were you. Alright guys, I'm honestly pretty tired after making this video, so if you could like and subscribe. If you watched all the way to the end, you might as well. And I actually had a few more topics to discuss, but I felt that the video is getting too long, so if you want me to continue this, just let me know. I don't want to put too much effort into a video that I don't know is going to succeed. Anyways, that's all I've got for today, and if you enjoyed watching and you learned something from this video, just tell me in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Remember to stay safe.